The auctioneer's gavel froze midair as Elizabeth Hawthorne clutched her 4-year-old son tighter, her knuckles white against his trembling shoulders. The crowd of rough miners and ranchers pressed closer, their hungry eyes calculating her worth like livestock. "$50 for the pair," shouted a bearded man, tobacco juice staining his chin. "Woman's good for cooking, boy's strong enough for ranch work." It wasn't a dead auction. It was a human sale, sanctioned by territorial law and a corrupt judge's gavel. Little Samuel buried his face against his mother's worn calico dress, his small body shaking as voices rose around them like vultures circling carrion. Mrs. Patterson from the general store covered her mouth in horror, remembering Elizabeth teaching Sunday school just months before, when she'd been a respectable widow, not a wanted fugitive. "Do I hear 60? The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip. Then a young cowboy's boots hit the platform boards with authority. $500. His quiet voice cut through the chaos like thunder. "I'll take them both." Who was this stranger, and why would he risk everything for a woman and child he'd never met? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Elizabeth Hawthorne had stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Silver Creek, Arizona territory with nothing but a battered leather satchel and her son's small hand in hers. She'd fled Boston after her husband's death revealed debts that would have sold them both into servitude, or worse. The frontier promised anonymity, a chance to start over as a schoolteacher in a town desperate for educated women. Elizabeth was 26, with auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper wire and green eyes that held both fierce intelligence and carefully hidden pain. She'd married young to escape her father's drinking, only to discover that Thomas Hawthorne's charm masked a violent temper and gambling addiction. His death from fever had seemed like salvation until his creditors came calling, demanding payment from his widow's flesh, if not his purse. Samuel, her 4-year-old son, possessed an old soul trapped in a child's body. With dark hair and thoughtful blue eyes, he spoke in complete sentences and read simple words, a prodigy who asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Most assumed he was Thomas's child, but Elizabeth carried a deeper secret. Samuel's real father had been her first love, a Union soldier who died at Gettysburg before he ever knew about his son. Daniel Whitmore had been tracking Elizabeth's story for 3 weeks, riding hard from Colorado territory after hearing whispers in a Denver saloon about a wanted woman and child facing auction in Silver Creek. At 28, Danny possessed the weathered face of a man who'd seen too much violence, with dark brown hair and steel blue eyes that missed nothing. His hands bore the calluses of honest work, but his horse and gear suggested resources beyond a typical drifter's means. Danny had left his own family 10 years earlier after a bitter confrontation with his father over moral principles, words that had cost him everything he'd once called home. He'd built a new life through grit and a lucky gold claim, but guilt over abandoning his responsibilities ate at him like acid. When he heard about Elizabeth's plight, something deep in his chest recognized a chance at redemption. The man orchestrating Elizabeth's downfall was Judge Nathaniel Blackstone, an imposing figure of 55 with silver hair and cold gray eyes. As her former father-in-law, he claimed legal authority over both woman and child, citing territorial laws about vagrant families and moral corruption. But his true motivation ran deeper. An obsession with control and family legacy that masked financial crimes spanning years. Silver Creek itself was a contradiction. A booming mining town where fortunes changed overnight, where federal law barely reached and territorial justice bent to whoever held the most gold. Adobe buildings lined dusty streets where Mexican vaqueros, Anglo settlers, and displaced Apaches created an uneasy mixture of cultures and tensions. It was a place where desperate people came to disappear, and where the powerful preyed on the powerless with impunity. The auction platform shuddered under Danny's boots as he stepped forward, his spurs chiming against the wooden planks. $500, more money than most of these men saw in a year, lay in neat gold coins across his weathered palm. The crowd fell silent, their earlier jeers dying in their throats as they stared at wealth they couldn't comprehend from a man they'd dismissed as another drifting cowhand. "You heard me?" Danny said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His steel-blue eyes swept the crowd before settling on the auctioneer's stunned face. $500, gold coin. That should settle whatever debts you claim these folks owe." Sheriff Josiah Crawford pushed through the crowd, his Confederate veteran's limp more pronounced when he hurried. His weathered hand rested on his gun belt, not threatening, but ready. "Now hold on there, stranger. This here's a legal proceeding." "You can't just what?" Danny's interruption was soft, but sharp as a blade. "Pay a debt. Last I checked, that's how commerce works in a civilized territory." He gestured toward Elizabeth and Samuel with his hat. "These people owe money. I'm offering to pay it. Seems straightforward enough." Judge Nathaniel Blackstone emerged from the courthouse steps, his black robes billowing like wings of some carrion bird. His silver hair gleamed in the afternoon sun, but his gray eyes held winter's chill. "The matter isn't quite so simple, young man. This woman stands accused of theft of family property and corruption of a minor child. Money alone cannot absolve such charges." Elizabeth's grip tightened on Samuel's shoulders. The boy had stopped trembling, his blue eyes fixed on Danny with a mixture of curiosity and desperate hope. "Who are you, mister?" Samuel whispered, his child's voice carrying in the sudden stillness. Danny knelt on one knee, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. Up close, Elizabeth could see the pain lines around his eyes, the premature silver threading through his dark hair. This was a man who'd carried heavy burdens. "Name's Daniel Whitmore, son, Danny if you prefer, and I'm someone who believes in helping folks when they need it most." "Are you going to hurt us?" Samuel asked with the directness only children possessed. "No, son. I'm here to help." Danny's voice gentled, and Elizabeth felt something crack open in her chest, a feeling she'd thought dead since Thomas's fists had beaten hope out of her. "Your mama, too. Nobody's going to hurt either of you while I'm around." Judge Blackstone's lips twisted into something resembling a smile. How touching. But territorial law requires more than good intentions, Mr. Whitmore. If you wish to assume responsibility for these individuals, you must enter into a formal indenture contract. 1 year of labor to satisfy the debts owed. The crowd murmured. Indenture was legal slavery with a prettier name, a way to own people without calling it ownership. Elizabeth's stomach turned to lead. She'd escaped one form of bondage only to face another. But Danny stood without hesitation. "Draw up the papers." "Danny, no." Elizabeth found her voice at last. "You don't understand what you're agreeing to. A year of—" "I understand perfectly, ma'am." His eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity, not the hungry look she'd grown used to from men. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Sometimes a year's the best bargain you can make. Sheriff Crawford cleared his throat. "There's conditions. The woman can't leave town without written permission. The boy remains under territorial court supervision. And you, Whitmore, you'll be responsible for their conduct. Any trouble they cause falls on your head." "Understood." Danny pulled a leather pouch from his vest, the weight of it making gold coins sing together like church bells. "Here's your 500. Now, where do I sign?" As the judge's clerk scurried to prepare documents, Danny turned back to Elizabeth and Samuel. The boy had crept closer, his small hand reaching toward Danny's silver belt buckle with fascination. Elizabeth started to pull him back, but Danny smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd seen in his face. "It's all right. He's curious." Danny crouched again, letting Samuel examine the intricate metalwork. "This was my grandfather's. See these symbols here? They're not just decoration. They tell a story." "What story?" Samuel breathed, tracing the patterns with one finger. "About a man who lost his way and had to find it again. About second chances and the people who help us find them." Danny's eyes flickered to Elizabeth. "Sometimes the most important stories are about choosing your own family." The papers crackled as Judge Blackstone signed with obvious reluctance. "1 year, Mr. Whitmore. We'll be watching closely to ensure all conditions are met." Danny stood, offered his arm to Elizabeth with old-fashioned courtesy. "Shall we go home, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Home. The word hit Elizabeth like a physical blow, not because it hurt, but because after years of running it sounded like salvation. The wagon ride to Danny's ranch passed in tense silence, broken only by the creak of leather and the steady clip-clop of his mare's hooves on the dusty trail. Elizabeth sat rigid beside him. Samuel nestled between them, the boy's head heavy against her arm as exhaustion finally claimed him. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the Arizona landscape into a shimmering mirage of red rocks and stubborn mesquite. "How far?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd learned to speak quietly around men. Loud voices invited attention she couldn't afford. "Another mile or so." Danny's hands were gentle on the reins, she noticed. No jerky movements, no impatience when the horse slowed to navigate rocky patches. "It's not much to look at from the outside, but it's solid. Built it myself, mostly." The ranch appeared suddenly as they crested a low hill, a modest adobe house with a red tile roof flanked by a sturdy barn and several outbuildings. But what struck Elizabeth wasn't the buildings themselves. It was the evidence of care everywhere she looked. Neat vegetable gardens, well-maintained fences, horses in the corral that gleamed with health. This wasn't the rough camp of a drifting cowhand. This was a home. "It's beautiful," she breathed, meaning it. After months of fleeing from one squalid boarding house to another, the sight of this peaceful haven made her chest tight with longing. Danny helped her down from the wagon, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. When he reached for Samuel, the boy stirred but didn't wake, simply transferring his trust from his mother's arms to this stranger's, with the fluid acceptance of childhood. Elizabeth's heart clenched watching Danny cradle her son, careful, protective, natural. "Let's get him settled first," Danny murmured, carrying Samuel toward the house. "He's had enough shocks for one day." The interior of the adobe house revealed more surprises. Hand-carved furniture, shelves lined with books, windows dressed with actual curtains, not the rough bachelor quarters Elizabeth had expected. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with what appeared to be family photographs, though she couldn't make out the faces from this distance. Danny laid Samuel on a comfortable sofa, covering him with a woven blanket. "Guest room's through there," he said, nodding toward a doorway. "You'll have privacy, both of you. I'll take the loft." Elizabeth studied his face, searching for deception, for the catch she knew must be coming. In her experience, men who offered help always wanted something in return. But Danny's expression remained steady, patient, as if he understood her suspicion and didn't resent it. "Why?" The word escaped before she could stop it. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." Danny was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the photographs on the mantel. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be judged for things that aren't your fault, to need help and have nowhere to turn." He looked back at her. Sometimes doing the right thing is reason enough. That evening, after Samuel had awakened and been coaxed into eating a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Elizabeth found herself sitting on the front porch while Danny taught her son to whittle. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that took her breath away, colors she'd almost forgotten existed during her months of fear and flight. "Mama, look!" Samuel held up a rough wooden horse, his face glowing with pride. "Danny showed me how to make the legs." "It's wonderful, sweetheart." Elizabeth's throat tightened at her son's joy. It had been so long since she'd seen him truly smile. Danny glanced up from his own carving, a more elaborate piece that was beginning to resemble a bird in flight. "He's got steady hands." "Natural talent." His father was good with his hands, too. The words slipped out before Elizabeth could catch them, and she immediately tensed, waiting for the inevitable questions about Thomas, about her past, but Danny just nodded. Good trait to pass on. Man needs to know how to make things, fix things, build something that lasts. As the stars emerged in the desert sky, Samuel's eyelids grew heavy. Elizabeth carried him inside, tucking him into the guest room bed that Danny had prepared with fresh sheets and a soft pillow. Her son was asleep before she finished pulling up the blankets. When she returned to the porch, Danny had built a small fire in an outdoor stone ring. The flames danced hypnotically, casting moving shadows across his weathered features. He looked up as she settled into the chair beside him. "Thank you," she said simply. "For today? For this? I know it's not conventional. Nothing about this situation is conventional." Danny poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing." Elizabeth studied his profile in the firelight. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone looking to take advantage. Most men who spend money on women expect certain considerations." Her cheeks burned, but she forced herself to continue. "The indenture contract gives you legal authority over me, over Samuel. That's a lot of power." Danny's jaw tightened. "Power's only worth having if you use it right. My father never learned that lesson." He looked at her directly. "Elizabeth, Mrs. Hawthorne, I want to be clear about something. You're not my property. Neither is Samuel. You're both free to leave anytime you want, contract or no contract. But the legal ramifications are my problem, not yours." His voice carried a quiet steel that made her believe him. "I didn't buy your freedom just to trap you in a different cage." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Elizabeth found herself relaxing for the first time in months, the constant tension in her shoulders finally beginning to ease. "Can I ask you something?" Danny's voice was careful, non-threatening. "That boy in there, Samuel, he's not your husband's child, is he?" Elizabeth's breath caught. "What makes you say that?" "The way Judge Blackstone talks about him. Claims of family property, blood rights. But there's something desperate underneath it all. Like he's afraid of losing something that was never really his to begin with." Elizabeth was quiet so long that Danny began to think she wouldn't answer. Finally she spoke, her voice barely audible above the settling embers. "Samuel's father was my first love, a soldier who died at Gettysburg before he knew I was carrying his child." She wrapped her arms around herself as if cold, though the desert night was still warm. "I married Thomas to give Samuel a name, a father. It wasn't a good marriage. I'm sorry." The words carried genuine sympathy. "For all of it, the loss, the marriage, what you've been through since. Judge Blackstone knows the truth about Samuel's parentage, but he's claimed him as family anyway. Says the boy carries Blackstone blood through his grandmother's line, that I'm an unfit mother trying to steal his rightful heir." Her laugh was bitter. The truth is, he just can't stand to lose control of anything he considers his. Danny nodded slowly. Men like that, they collect people like trophies. Can't bear to see anyone escape their influence. You sound like you speak from experience. Danny's expression darkened, more than I care to admit. The first month at the ranch passed like a dream Elizabeth was afraid to trust. Samuel bloomed under Danny's patient guidance, learning to feed the chickens, gather eggs, and help with simple chores that made him feel important. His laughter returned, tentative at first, then growing stronger each day as he realized no one would punish him for making noise or taking up space. Danny proved to be an enigma wrapped in kindness. He rose before dawn to tend the animals, never complained about the extra mouths to feed, and treated Samuel with a gentle authority that the boy responded to instinctively. With Elizabeth, he maintained careful respect, helpful without being presumptuous, protective without being possessive. Yet she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. One morning in early November, Elizabeth was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard horses approaching. Her blood froze as she recognized Sheriff Crawford's voice calling out a greeting. Samuel, who'd been playing nearby with his wooden horse, immediately ran to her side, pressing against her skirts. "Morning, Sheriff!" Danny's voice carried from the front porch, calm and unhurried. "What brings you out this way?" "Routine check, Whitmore. Part of the indenture agreement." Crawford's boots crunched on gravel as he dismounted. "Judge wants to make sure everything's proper out here." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she unpinned a shirt from the line. She'd known this day would come. The watching, the scrutiny, the constant threat of Samuel being taken if they found any excuse. "Everything's fine, Sheriff," Danny said. "Mrs. Hawthorne's proving quite capable. The boy's adjusting well. Mind if I see for myself?" It wasn't really a question. Elizabeth forced herself to walk calmly around the corner of the house, Samuel's hand clutched in hers. Sheriff Crawford stood near his horse, his Confederate veteran's uniform still crisp despite the desert dust. His eyes swept over her with professional assessment. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he touched his hat brim. "How are you finding ranch life?" "It's peaceful, Sheriff." She kept her voice steady. "Mr. Whitmore has been very kind." Crawford's gaze dropped to Samuel, who was hiding partially behind his mother's skirts. "And you, boy? You being treated well?" Samuel nodded silently, his blue eyes wide but unafraid. Danny had taught him that silence was sometimes the safest response to authority figures, a lesson that made Elizabeth's heart ache for what her son had already learned about the world. "Judge Blackstone's been asking about the boy's education," Crawford continued. "Wants to make sure he's receiving proper Christian instruction, learning his letters and numbers." "I'm teaching him myself," Elizabeth said quickly. "I was a schoolteacher back in Boston, yes." Crawford's interruption was sharp. "Judge mentioned your background. Seems you left that position rather suddenly." Danny stepped forward, his presence solid and reassuring at Elizabeth's shoulder. "The boy's reading at a level above his age, Sheriff. Mrs. Hawthorne's doing fine work with his education." Crawford studied them all for a moment longer, then remounted his horse. "Well, everything seems in order. For now. But the judge wants to see progress reports. Regular ones. And he's particular about what constitutes proper moral instruction for the boy." After the sheriff rode away, Elizabeth sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly weak. Samuel climbed into her lap, sensing her distress even if he didn't fully understand it. "They're going to keep coming," she whispered. "Finding reasons, looking for excuses to take him." Danny sat beside them on the steps, his shoulder touching hers. "Then we'll make sure they don't find any." As November deepened, the ranch settled into rhythms that felt increasingly natural. Elizabeth cooked meals that filled the house with warmth and spice, while Danny taught Samuel to ride on an old gentle mare named Buttercup. Evenings found them gathered around the fireplace, Danny reading aloud from books of adventure and poetry while Samuel drew pictures, and Elizabeth mended clothes or worked on a quilt she'd started from fabric scraps. It was during one of these peaceful evenings that Danny finally began to reveal pieces of his past. They'd put Samuel to bed and were sitting by the dying fire when Elizabeth noticed him staring at the photographs on the mantel with particular intensity. "Family?" she asked gently. Danny nodded slowly. "My father, mostly. Some cousins? Haven't seen them in 10 years. What happened?" For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he rose and retrieved one of the photographs, a formal portrait of a stern-faced man in expensive clothes standing behind a seated woman and young man who bore a strong resemblance to Danny. "My father believed that moral compromise was sometimes necessary for the greater good, that the law could be interpreted to serve those worthy of power." Danny's voice was carefully controlled. "I disagreed, rather loudly and publicly." Elizabeth studied the photograph. There was wealth evident in every detail: the man's gold watch chain, the woman's silk dress, the ornate furniture. "What kind of law?" "Territorial court judge, very respected, very influential." Danny's laugh was bitter. "Very corrupt, though most people chose not to see it. Easier to believe in the righteousness of authority than to question uncomfortable truths." Understanding dawned like ice water in Elizabeth's veins. "Your father, is he still practicing law?" Danny met her eyes, his expression grim. "Judge Nathaniel Blackstone of the Arizona Territorial Court. My estranged father, and the man currently trying to destroy your life." The revelation hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Samuel's wooden horse fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering on the floor. You're his son, but you never said, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was afraid you'd run." Danny's honesty was stark, painful. "Afraid you'd think this was some elaborate game between him and me, with you and Samuel as pawns." "Isn't it?" The words came out harsher than she intended, but fear made her cruel. "How do I know this isn't some scheme? That you're not just another way for him to control us?" Danny flinched as if she'd struck him. "Because 10 years ago I gave up everything, my inheritance, my family name, my place in society, rather than be part of his corruption. I've been Daniel Whitmore, not Daniel Blackstone, ever since." Elizabeth's mind raced, fitting pieces together like a puzzle. "The gold claim, this ranch, how did you afford it if you're estranged from your family?" "Honest work and lucky timing." Danny pulled out a deed from a wooden box on the mantel. "This ranch belonged to a Mexican family before the territory changed hands. When they were forced to sell, I made sure they got fair price and safe passage to relatives in California. The gold I found on the back 40 was just providence, I suppose." She studied his face in the firelight, searching for deception. "Why should I believe you?" "Because tomorrow morning we're riding into town so you can verify everything I've told you. Bank records, property deeds, testimony from people who knew me before and after the split with my father." Danny's voice was steady, resigned. "You have the right to know exactly who you're trusting with your life and your son's future." That night, Elizabeth lay awake listening to Samuel's peaceful breathing, her mind churning with implications. Danny Whitmore, Daniel Blackstone, slept in the loft above, and she found herself straining to hear his movements, as if the sound could tell her something about his character. Was he the gentle protector he seemed, or was she once again being manipulated by forces beyond her understanding? The next morning brought their first real crisis. Elizabeth was preparing breakfast when Samuel burst through the kitchen door, his face flushed with excitement and terror. "Mama, there's men coming, bad men like the ones in town." Through the window, Elizabeth could see dust clouds on the horizon, multiple riders approaching fast. Danny appeared from the barn, his face grim as he shaded his eyes against the morning sun. "Take Samuel inside," he called to her. "Lock the door and don't open it unless you hear my voice." "Danny, what's happening?" But he was already moving, checking his rifle, positioning himself with clear sight lines to the approaching riders. Elizabeth grabbed Samuel and hurried into the house, her heart hammering against her ribs. The riders proved to be Sheriff Crawford and 3 other men, deputies from their badges, but rough-looking types who seemed more comfortable with violence than law. They reined up in front of the house, their horses snorting and stamping from the hard ride. "Whitmore!" Crawford's voice carried clearly through the windows. "We need to talk." Danny stepped into view, his rifle held casually but ready. "Then talk, Sheriff. No need for the escort." Judge Blackstone's received some disturbing reports about conditions out here, allegations of improper conduct, moral corruption of a minor child. Elizabeth's breath caught. Through the curtains she could see Dr. Cornelius Ashford among the riders, the territory's only physician, a thin, nervous man whose hands shook slightly even when he wasn't drinking. He'd examined Samuel during their time in town, pronouncing the boy healthy but making notes that had seemed overly detailed at the time. "What kind of allegations?" Danny's voice was dangerously quiet. Crawford shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable but determined to see this through. "Reports that the woman and child are living intimately with you. That proper Christian separation of quarters isn't being maintained, that the boy's being exposed to immoral influences." "Those are serious accusations, Sheriff. I assume you have evidence?" Dr. Ashford cleared his throat nervously. "I've prepared a medical examination protocol to verify the status of all parties involved for the court record." The meaning was clear, and Elizabeth's stomach turned to lead. They wanted to examine her, to humiliate her, to find evidence of impropriety that would justify taking Samuel. It was the same pattern she'd seen in Boston, in every town where desperate women found themselves at the mercy of men who held all the power. Danny's stance shifted almost imperceptibly, and Elizabeth realized he was preparing to fight. 1 man against 4, with no hope of winning, but determined to protect them anyway. Her heart broke and soared simultaneously at the sight of such foolish, necessary courage. But before violence could erupt, another voice cut through the tension, young, female, and blazingly angry. "Daddy, what in heaven's name do you think you're doing?" A young woman on horseback was approaching from the direction of town, her riding habit dusty from hard travel, but her bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She had Crawford's eyes but softer features, and her fury was magnificent to behold. "Sarah Beth!" Crawford's authority crumbled at the sight of his daughter. "What are you doing here?" "I told you to stay in town, and I told you this whole business was shameful." Sarah Beth Crawford reined up beside the deputies, her horse dancing with nervous energy. "Going after that poor woman and her child like a pack of wolves! Have you completely forgotten what it means to be a Christian man?" Sarah Beth Crawford's intervention created a momentary standoff that crackled with tension. Her father's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger, while the deputies shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, uncertain whether to follow orders or defer to the sheriff's daughter, whose moral authority clearly exceeded their own. "Sarah Beth, you don't understand the complexities of the situation," Crawford began, but his daughter cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "I understand perfectly well, Daddy. Judge Blackstone is using you to harass these good people because his pride can't bear losing control." Her voice carried across the yard with the clarity of someone who'd never learned to doubt her right to speak. "And you're letting him turn you into something Mama would be ashamed of." The mention of his late wife hit Crawford like a physical blow. Elizabeth watched from the window as his shoulders sagged, years of compromise and moral flexibility suddenly weighing heavy on his frame. But before he could respond, Dr. Ashford's nervous voice interjected. "Miss Crawford, with respect, the medical examination is a legal requirement. Judge's orders. We can't simply what?" Treat a woman with basic human dignity? Sarah Beth's contempt was withering. Dr. Ashford, when was the last time you examined yourself for the moral corruption you're so eager to find in others? The doctor's hands trembled more violently at the accusation, and Elizabeth realized with sudden clarity that Sarah Beth knew something, some secret that gave her power over the physician. The young woman's next words confirmed it. Perhaps we should discuss your medical practices with the Territorial Medical Board. I'm sure they'd be fascinated to learn about your innovative treatments for nervous conditions. Doctor. Ashford's face went white as parchment. Miss Crawford, I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Doctor. I'm stating facts. And if you force me to state them publicly in court testimony, it will end your career and likely land you in territorial prison. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Danny remained motionless, his rifle ready but not raised, waiting to see how this unlikely salvation would play out. Inside the house, Samuel pressed against Elizabeth's side, sensing the adult tensions without understanding their source. Finally, Sheriff Crawford spoke, his voice thick with defeat and self-loathing. "Stand down, men. We're returning to town." "But, Sheriff," one of the deputies protested, "Judge Blackstone's orders." "Judge Blackstone can take up his concerns through proper legal channels," Crawford interrupted, "not through intimidation and harassment." He looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and pain. "Sarah Beth's right. This isn't what we swore an oath to uphold." As the riders prepared to leave, Dr. Ashford's withdrawal symptoms finally overcame his composure. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold his reins, and sweat beaded his pale forehead despite the cool morning air. Sarah Beth watched his struggle with clinical detachment. "Doctor, perhaps you should consider seeking treatment for your condition before it compromises your medical judgment further," she suggested with false kindness. "I hear there are excellent facilities back east." After the riders disappeared into the distance, Sarah Beth dismounted and approached the house with confident strides. Danny lowered his rifle, his posture relaxing for the first time since the confrontation began. Elizabeth emerged from the house with Samuel clinging to her hand, unsure whether this young woman was friend or another threat in disguise. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Sarah Beth said warmly, extending a gloved hand. "I'm Sarah Beth Crawford, and I owe you an apology for my father's behavior. He's not a bad man, just weak when it comes to standing up to bullies." Elizabeth shook the offered hand cautiously. "Thank you for whatever you did back there. I don't understand what happened, but I reminded some people that their secrets aren't as secret as they think," Sarah Beth replied with a meaningful glance at Danny. "Dr. Ashford has been supplementing his income by providing certain substances to people who can afford his discretion. Morphine, specifically, acquired through falsified medical prescriptions." Danny's expression hardened. "My father's been using an addict to create false medical records?" "Among other things." Sarah Beth's voice carried grim satisfaction. "Your father has quite an elaborate network of compromised officials, Mr. Whitmore. Or should I say, Mr. Blackstone?" Elizabeth's breath caught. "You know who he is?" "I've known since the day he bought you at auction. Daniel Blackstone was something of a legend in territorial legal circles, the judge's son who chose principle over profit, who walked away from everything rather than become part of his father's corruption." Sarah Beth smiled at Danny with genuine admiration. "Most people called you a fool. I always thought you were brave." The conversation moved inside the house, where Sarah Beth proved to be a font of information about Judge Blackstone's activities. Over coffee and Elizabeth's fresh-baked biscuits, she painted a picture of systematic corruption that made Elizabeth's stomach turn. "He's been manipulating legal proceedings for years," Sarah Beth explained, accepting a second cup of coffee. Falsifying documents, intimidating witnesses, taking bribes from mining companies who want favorable rulings on land disputes. The indenture auction was just his latest innovation, a way to acquire property and labor while appearing to uphold the law. "But why Samuel?" Elizabeth asked, watching her son play quietly with his wooden animals near the fireplace. "He's just a child. What possible value could he have to the judge?" Sarah Beth and Danny exchanged a look that made Elizabeth's blood chill. "There's something we haven't told you," Sarah Beth said gently. "Something about Samuel's heritage." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth's voice was sharp with sudden fear. Danny took a deep breath. "My father doesn't just want Samuel because of some legal claim about family property. He wants him because he believes Samuel is actually his biological grandson." "That's impossible," Elizabeth whispered. "Samuel's father was a Union soldier. He died at Gettysburg. I told you." "You told me about your first love, yes. But you didn't tell me his name." Danny's voice was infinitely gentle. "Was it Marcus Blackstone? Captain Marcus Blackstone of the Pennsylvania 7th Cavalry?" Elizabeth's world tilted sideways. The coffee cup slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the wooden floor. Samuel looked up from his play, alarmed by the sound, but the adults paid no attention to the spreading stain. How could you know that?" "Because Marcus was my older brother," Danny said simply. "The golden son, the heir apparent, the one who enlisted to prove his patriotism and died a hero's death at Gettysburg. My father has spent 20 years grieving him, building him into a legend that no living person could match." The room spun around Elizabeth as pieces of a puzzle she'd never known existed clicked into place. Marcus had spoken of his family, a successful father, a younger brother who disappointed everyone, a mother who died when he was young. But she'd been so young herself, so caught up in first love and the tragedy of wartime romance that she'd never pressed for details. "So Samuel is—" she began, but couldn't finish the sentence. "My nephew," Danny confirmed, "and my father's legitimate heir in his mind, the continuation of the Blackstone bloodline through his beloved eldest son." Sarah Beth leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but urgent. "That's why Judge Blackstone is so desperate to gain custody. It's not just about control, it's about legacy. He sees Samuel as his chance to raise Marcus's son properly, to mold him into the heir he always wanted." "But I never told Marcus about the baby," Elizabeth whispered. "He died before I knew I was pregnant. How could your father possibly know?" Danny's expression grew darker. "Because he's been investigating you since the day you arrived in Silver Creek. Following your trail back to Boston, to the boarding houses where you stayed, to the midwife who delivered Samuel. He's built a complete dossier on your life, Elizabeth. He knows everything." The implications hit Elizabeth like hammer blows. Her flight from Boston, her desperate attempts to build a new life, all of it had been watched, catalogued, used against her. She'd never been free, never been safe. Judge Blackstone had simply been waiting for the right moment to spring his trap. "There's more," Sarah Beth said quietly. "The medical records Dr. Ashford created about your mental state, the testimony about your unfitness as a mother. It's all being prepared for a custody hearing. Judge Blackstone plans to have Samuel declared a ward of the territorial court and place him in his own custody for proper upbringing." "When?" Danny's voice was deadly calm. "Next week. The papers are already drawn up, the witnesses already coached." Sarah Beth's expression was grim. "He's moving fast because he knows the federal authorities are starting to ask questions about his court's practices. He wants Samuel secured before anyone can interfere." Elizabeth stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she could see Samuel's small handprints on the glass, evidence of his morning ritual of watching for Danny to return from the barn. The sight of those innocent marks broke something inside her chest. "What happens if he gets custody?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "He'll send Samuel back east," Danny replied, "to a proper boarding school where he can be educated as befits a Blackstone heir. You'll be forbidden contact, probably confined to an asylum for treatment of your supposed mental condition." The casual way he delivered this devastating news made Elizabeth understand that Danny had been thinking about this scenario, planning for it. The realization both comforted and terrified her. "Unless," Sarah Beth interjected, "we can prove Judge Blackstone's corruption before the custody hearing. Get federal marshals involved, show that his entire court is compromised." "With what evidence?" Danny asked. "Dr. Ashford's addiction? Your father's reluctant cooperation? None of that directly proves financial corruption or abuse of judicial authority." Sarah Beth smiled, an expression that held more steel than warmth. "Actually, I think we can do better than that. You see, I've been keeping my own records of my father's activities, and some of Judge Blackstone's associates have been indiscreet in their conversations around someone they consider harmless." She reached into her riding satchel and withdrew a thick folder filled with papers, photographs, and what appeared to be copies of official documents. Financial records showing payments from mining companies before favorable rulings, correspondence discussing the manipulation of land claims, even some of Dr. Ashford's prescription forgeries. Danny stared at the folder as if it contained dynamite. "Sarah Beth, why would you—" "Because I believe in justice, Mr. Blackstone. Real justice, not the purchased variety your father deals in." Her voice carried conviction that reminded Elizabeth why this young woman had been able to face down armed deputies without flinching. "And because I've watched too many good people suffer while bad men prospered." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the desert, promising the kind of dramatic weather that seemed to mirror the upheaval in their lives. Elizabeth watched the approaching darkness and made a decision that surprised even her. "What do we need to do?" The storm that had been building all afternoon finally broke just as they finished formulating their plan. Rain lashed against the windows of the ranch house while thunder rolled across the desert like artillery fire, a fitting soundtrack to the war they were preparing to wage against Judge Blackstone's corruption. Sarah Beth had agreed to carry their evidence to the federal marshal's office in Phoenix, a 3-day ride that would require her to slip away from town without her father's knowledge. "I can manage Daddy," she assured them, securing the incriminating documents in an oiled leather pouch. "He'll assume I'm visiting the Hendersons at their spread north of town. I've done it before when I needed to. Gather information." Elizabeth watched this young woman, barely 21 she'd learned, prepare to risk everything for people she barely knew, and felt humbled by such casual courage. "Sarah Beth, if you're caught, if your father finds out what you're doing, then I'll face the consequences," Sarah Beth replied firmly. "Some things are worth the risk, Mrs. Hawthorne. Your son's freedom is one of them." After Sarah Beth departed into the storm, the ranch house felt simultaneously safer and more vulnerable. Danny spent the evening cleaning weapons and checking ammunition while Elizabeth tried to maintain normal routines for Samuel's sake. But the boy was sensitive to adult tensions, and his usual bedtime chatter was replaced by anxious silence. "Mama," he whispered as she tucked him into bed, "are the bad men going to take me away?" Elizabeth's throat closed around a lie she couldn't speak. Instead, she smoothed his dark hair, so like his father's, so like Danny's, and chose honesty tempered with hope. "Some people want to, sweetheart, but Danny and I won't let that happen. We're going to fight to keep our family together." "Is Danny really my papa's brother?" Samuel asked, his 4-year-old mind struggling with the complex relationships that governed his fate. "Yes, he is, which makes him your uncle, and makes you very special indeed." Elizabeth kissed his forehead. "Try to sleep now. Tomorrow might be a big day. But sleep proved elusive for all of them. Elizabeth lay awake, listening to the rain and Danny's restless movements in the loft above, while somewhere in the darkness, forces beyond their control prepared to shatter the fragile peace they'd built. The attack came at dawn, just as the storm was breaking, and the first pale light crept across the desert. Elizabeth woke to the sound of Samuel crying, and Danny's boots hitting the floor above as he responded to sounds she hadn't yet registered, the soft nickering of horses being deliberately quieted, the creak of leather, whispered commands. "Elizabeth!" Danny's voice was urgent but controlled. "Get Samuel and get to the root cellar. Now!" She didn't argue or ask questions. Grabbing Samuel from his bed, she wrapped him in a blanket and carried him through the kitchen to the narrow door that led to the underground storage space Danny had shown her on their second day at the ranch. The cellar was cool and dark, lined with shelves of preserved food and emergency supplies that now seemed prophetically wise. "Stay quiet, baby," she whispered to Samuel, who had stopped crying but trembled against her. "It's like a game of hide and seek. We have to be very, very quiet." Through the wooden floor above, she could hear Danny's voice, calm and authoritative despite the circumstances. "Gentlemen, you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you state your business and be on your way." "Our business is with the woman and child," came an unfamiliar voice. "Judge's orders." "They're to come with us for protective custody pending tomorrow's hearing." "I don't see any legal warrants," Danny replied. "And last I checked, protective custody required actual danger, not manufactured threats." A different voice, rougher and less patient. "We got all the legal authority we need, Blackstone. Now step aside before this gets unpleasant." Elizabeth's blood froze at the use of Danny's real name. These weren't official deputies. They were hired guns, men who dealt in violence rather than law. The kind of men Judge Blackstone would use when legal channels failed him. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Danny said, his voice carrying the same quiet steel Elizabeth had heard when he faced down the auction crowd. "This is my property, and these people are under my protection." What followed was a flurry of movement, shouted commands, and the crack of gunfire that made Samuel whimper against Elizabeth's chest. She pressed her hand over his mouth, not to silence him but to muffle her own sobs as she listened to Danny fighting alone against impossible odds. The silence that followed the violence was worse than the gunfire. Elizabeth waited, counting heartbeats, praying to a God who seemed to have abandoned them to cruel men and corrupted justice. Then she heard footsteps on the kitchen floor above, heavy boots searching through rooms they had no right to enter. "They ain't here, Kane," someone said. "Place is empty except for Blackstone. Check the outbuildings. They didn't just vanish." The voice held authority and cruelty in equal measure. "Judge wants that boy found before the hearing. Without the child, his whole legal strategy falls apart." Elizabeth held Samuel tighter as the searchers moved through the house above them. Her son had fallen into the strange quiet that traumatized children sometimes exhibited, his body limp with shock even as his eyes remained wide and aware. She whispered meaningless comfort into his hair and planned desperately for what would come next. The searchers eventually moved outside, their voices growing fainter as they checked the barn and other structures. Elizabeth waited until she was certain they were gone before carefully lifting the cellar door and peering into the devastated kitchen. Chairs were overturned, cabinet doors hung open, and muddy boot prints tracked across the floors she'd kept so carefully clean. But it was the sight in the main room that nearly brought her to her knees. Danny lay motionless beside the overturned table, blood seeping from a head wound into the wooden floor she'd swept just yesterday. Her careful, gentle protector reduced to stillness by men who served a corrupt judge's ambitions. "Danny!" She was beside him in seconds, Samuel forgotten in her terror. But as she reached for his pulse, his eyes opened, unfocused but alive. "Elizabeth." His voice was barely a whisper. "They're gone?" "For now." She pressed a kitchen towel against his head wound, relief making her hands shake. "How badly are you hurt?" "I'll live." Danny tried to sit up, winced, and accepted her help. "Did they find you?" "No, we stayed hidden like you said." Elizabeth helped him to a chair, noting the way he favored his left arm. "Danny, we can't stay here. They'll be back, probably with more men." "I know." Danny's eyes were clearer now, though blood still trickled from the gash on his scalp. "There's a place I know, an old mining camp about 10 miles north. Abandoned, but the buildings are solid. We can hide there until Sarah Beth returns with help." Elizabeth looked around the ransacked house, their home for these few precious weeks, and felt something hard and angry crystallize in her chest. Judge Blackstone had taken her first husband through violence, driven her from Boston through legal persecution, and now destroyed the only peace she'd known since Samuel's birth. But she was no longer the frightened woman who'd stood on an auction block praying for salvation. "No," she said firmly. "No more running, no more hiding. If your father wants a fight, let's give him one he won't forget." Danny stared at her, perhaps seeing for the first time the steel that had carried her through years of abuse and months of flight. "Elizabeth, you don't understand what you're saying. He has the law on his side, paid enforcers, the whole territorial system." "He has corruption and fear on his side," Elizabeth corrected. "But we have the truth, and Sarah Beth is carrying evidence that can destroy him." She lifted Samuel, who wrapped his arms around her neck with the desperate grip of a child who'd seen too much. "Tomorrow's hearing isn't just about custody of Samuel. It's about whether justice exists in this territory or if it's all been sold to the highest bidder." Danny struggled to his feet, swaying slightly from the head injury. "What are you proposing?" Elizabeth looked at him. This man who'd sacrificed wealth and family for principle, who'd fought impossible odds to protect her son, who'd given them home and hope when they had neither. "I'm proposing we walk into that courthouse tomorrow and tell the truth. All of it. About your father's corruption, about Samuel's real parentage, about what just happened here." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "And if we're going to lose Samuel anyway, let's make sure the whole territory knows exactly what kind of man is stealing him." Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, but Elizabeth no longer feared the coming tempest. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. The courthouse in Silver Creek had never seen such a crowd. Word of the custody hearing had spread through the territory like wildfire, drawing miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, and even Apache traders who rarely ventured into town. They filled the wooden benches, lined the walls, and spilled out onto the courthouse steps, all drawn by the drama of a corrupt judge potentially seizing a child from his mother. Elizabeth sat in the front row, Samuel pressed close to her side, both of them dressed in their finest clothes, which wasn't saying much after months of flight and hardship. Danny sat beside them, his head wound bandaged, but his jaw set with grim determination. The events of yesterday had transformed something fundamental in their relationship. They were no longer reluctant allies, but a family united against destruction. Judge Nathaniel Blackstone entered the courtroom with the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. His silver hair gleamed in the morning light streaming through tall windows, and his black robes rustled with the whisper of power. But Elizabeth noticed the tightness around his eyes, the way his gaze avoided his estranged son's face. Even tyrants, apparently, could feel shame. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The Honorable Judge Nathaniel Blackstone presiding. First matter, territorial custody petition regarding the minor child Samuel Hawthorne." Dr. Cornelius Ashford was called as the first witness, his hands trembling visibly as he approached the stand. The physician looked worse than Elizabeth had ever seen him, pale, sweating, his withdrawal symptoms clearly worsening. But Judge Blackstone's cold stare seemed to straighten his spine with desperate determination. "Dr. Ashford," the territorial attorney began, "you've examined both the defendant Elizabeth Hawthorne and the minor child Samuel. What are your professional conclusions regarding Mrs. Hawthorne's fitness as a mother?" Dr. Ashford's hands shook as he opened his medical file. "Mrs. Hawthorne exhibits clear signs of mental instability, delusions of persecution, erratic behavior, inability to provide stable care for her child. In my professional opinion, she represents a danger to the minor's well-being." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Elizabeth felt Samuel stiffen beside her, and she squeezed his hand reassuringly. They'd prepared him for this, explained that some people would say untrue things, but that didn't make them real. "And your recommendation, doctor?" "Immediate removal of the child to proper guardian custody, preferably a relative with the moral and financial resources to ensure proper upbringing." Dr. Ashford's voice grew stronger as he delivered the rehearsed testimony. The child's grandfather, Judge Blackstone, would provide ideal placement. The territorial attorney smiled with satisfaction. "Thank you, doctor." No further questions. But as Dr. Ashford started to leave the witness stand, a new voice cut through the courtroom's murmur. "Actually, Your Honor, I have some questions for Dr. Ashford." Every head turned toward the back of the courtroom where a tall man in a federal marshal's badge stood beside Sarah Beth Crawford. The young woman looked travel-worn but triumphant, her saddlebags bulging with the evidence they'd sent her to deliver. "I am Federal Marshal James Morrison," the man announced, his voice carrying the absolute authority of Washington, D.C. "And I'm here to investigate allegations of corruption in this territorial court." Judge Blackstone's face went white, then flushed red with fury. "This is highly irregular, Marshal. This court operates under territorial jurisdiction, which operates under federal oversight, Your Honor." Marshal Morrison's smile was as cold as winter wind. "Particularly when allegations of judicial misconduct reach the territorial governor's office." The marshal approached Dr. Ashford, who looked ready to collapse. "Doctor, are you familiar with federal regulations regarding the dispensing of controlled medical substances?" Of course, Marshal, but I don't see how that relates to—" "Are you aware that falsifying medical prescriptions to obtain morphine constitutes a federal crime?" The marshal's question hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. "Punishable by up to 20 years in federal prison?" Dr. Ashford's remaining composure crumbled entirely. His hands shook so violently he could barely remain standing, and sweat poured down his pale face despite the cool morning air. "Marshal, I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding, Doctor. We have documented evidence of your prescription forgeries, your addiction, and your willingness to falsify medical records in exchange for continued access to morphine." Marshal Morrison held up a thick folder, "including sworn testimony from pharmacists in 3 different towns about your suspicious prescription requests." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Elizabeth watched Judge Blackstone's carefully constructed case begin to crumble, but she felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness at how much suffering one man's corruption had caused. "Furthermore," Marshal Morrison continued, "we have evidence that your medical testimony in this case was purchased through the provision of illegal substances, making it worthless in any court of law." Dr. Ashford's collapse was complete. He slumped in the witness chair, his withdrawal symptoms and fear combining to reduce him to a shaking wreck. I need help." "The morphine, I can't. I'll tell you everything, but please, I need medical attention." "You'll receive appropriate medical care, doctor, in federal custody where you can provide testimony about the corruption you've witnessed in this court." Marshal Morrison gestured to 2 deputy marshals who'd been waiting outside. Please escort Dr. Ashford to secure medical detention." As the disgraced physician was led away, Judge Blackstone struggled to maintain control of proceedings that were rapidly slipping from his grasp. "Marshal, I must protest this disruption of legitimate territorial legal proceedings." "Your Honor," Marshal Morrison interrupted, "I have federal warrants for the arrest of multiple individuals in this courtroom, including yourself, on charges of judicial corruption, conspiracy, and violation of civil rights under federal law." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Some spectators cheered, others shouted protests, and several men Elizabeth recognized as Judge Blackstone's associates quietly began edging toward the exits. But Marshal Morrison's deputies had already positioned themselves at all the doors. "However," the marshal continued, raising his voice above the tumult, "before executing these warrants, I believe this community deserves to hear the complete truth about what's been happening in their name." He turned to Elizabeth, his expression gentling. "Mrs. Hawthorne, would you be willing to tell this court, under oath, about your experiences with Judge Blackstone's version of justice?" Elizabeth rose on unsteady legs, Samuel's hand still clasped in hers. For a moment she was transported back to that auction platform surrounded by hostile faces and cruel intentions, but this time was different. This time she wasn't alone. "Your Honor," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I came to Silver Creek seeking nothing more than a chance to build a quiet life for my son and myself. I was a schoolteacher, a widow trying to escape debts my husband had hidden from me. I never asked for wealth or position or power, just the opportunity to work honestly and raise my child in peace." She looked directly at Judge Blackstone, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, not as an all-powerful authority figure, but as a frightened old man whose corruption was finally catching up with him. "Instead, I found myself subjected to a system that treated women and children as property to be bought and sold. That created false medical records to justify stealing a child from his mother. That used the law as a weapon against the innocent while protecting the guilty." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. "My son's father was Captain Marcus Blackstone, who died at Gettysburg before he knew about Samuel's existence. I never tried to claim anything from the Blackstone family. Not money, not recognition, not even acknowledgement. All I wanted was to raise Marcus's son with love and dignity, the way his father would have wanted." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Elizabeth felt the weight of their attention, their sympathy, their growing anger at the injustices she described. Judge Blackstone could have approached me honestly, could have asked to be part of Samuel's life, to help raise his grandson with kindness and respect. Instead, he chose corruption, intimidation, and violence. He turned our legal system into a tool for personal vengeance and family control. She lifted Samuel, who had remained remarkably calm throughout the proceedings. "This is Marcus Blackstone's son, Samuel. He's 4 years old. He likes horses and stories and wooden toys carved by gentle hands. He's never hurt anyone, never asked for anything more than a mother's love and a safe place to grow up. But he's been treated as a prize to be won rather than a child to be cherished." Elizabeth's voice grew stronger, fueled by months of suppressed anger and fear. "If this territory's legal system can steal a child from his loving mother based on lies and corruption, then none of us are safe. None of our children are protected. None of our rights mean anything." The courtroom erupted again, but this time the mood was clearly on Elizabeth's side. She could see tears in many eyes, anger on many faces, a community finally understanding how thoroughly they'd been betrayed by a man they'd trusted to protect them. Judge Blackstone rose slowly, his face a mask of defeat and desperate fury. "Elizabeth, you don't understand. Samuel is all I have left of Marcus. My son, my heir, the continuation of everything I've built. You have nothing left of Marcus. Danny interrupted, standing to face his father for the first time in 10 years. Because Marcus was everything you're not: honest, honorable, willing to sacrifice for others instead of sacrificing others for himself. The confrontation between father and son held the courtroom spellbound. Two men who shared blood but nothing else, representing different visions of what power and authority should mean. Marcus died fighting for justice and freedom, Danny continued, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying it. You've spent 20 years corrupting both in his memory. Samuel deserves better than to be raised by a man who sees him as property rather than a precious gift. Judge Blackstone's composure finally shattered completely. You self-righteous fool! You threw away everything: wealth, position, influence. For what? For principle. For the approval of people who don't matter? I threw away corruption, Danny replied simply. And I found something infinitely more valuable: the ability to sleep peacefully at night, knowing I've never used my power to harm the innocent. Marshal Morrison stepped forward, the federal warrants in his hand. Nathaniel Blackstone, you are under arrest for conspiracy, judicial corruption, violation of civil rights, and multiple federal crimes related to the abuse of your judicial authority. As the handcuffs clicked around Judge Blackstone's wrists, Elizabeth felt Samuel's grip tighten on her hand. The boy had watched his grandfather's arrest with wide, serious eyes, perhaps understanding more than anyone realized about the complex adult emotions swirling around him. It's over, sweetheart, she whispered to him. We can go home now. But even as she said it, Elizabeth realized she wasn't sure where home was anymore. The ranch had been violated, their temporary sanctuary destroyed by the very violence they'd sought to escape. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but finally blessedly free. 6 months later, the Silver Creek Ranch looked nothing like the place that had been ransacked by Judge Blackstone's hired gunmen. Fresh paint gleamed on the rebuilt front porch, new curtains fluttered in windows that had been repaired and enlarged, and the sound of children's laughter drifted across the yard where Samuel played with 3 other youngsters whose families had become part of their extended community. Elizabeth stood in the doorway of what was now officially called the Silver Creek School, watching her husband, the word still sent warmth through her chest, led a reading lesson for 8 local children whose parents had pooled resources to hire her as their teacher. Danny had insisted she use the front room of their house for the school, claiming it gave him pleasure to hear young voices learning and growing where there had once been only adult worries and fears. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The weeks following Judge Blackstone's arrest had been filled with legal complications, testimony for federal prosecutors, and the slow work of healing from trauma that had touched them all. Samuel had struggled with nightmares for months, often waking to search frantically for Elizabeth and Danny, needing physical proof that his family remained intact. But time and patience had worked their gentle magic. Samuel's nightmares had gradually given way to peaceful sleep. His withdrawn behavior had blossomed back into the curious, talkative nature Elizabeth remembered from before their troubles began. The boy, who'd once flinched at loud voices, now commanded the attention of younger children with elaborate stories about brave cowboys and magical horses. Mrs. Whitmore? Young Jenny Patterson, the general store owner's daughter, raised her hand eagerly. Can you tell us more about the letters that make the "they" sound? Elizabeth smiled at the eager faces turned toward her. Of course, Jenny. Let's work through some examples together. The afternoon lessons concluded with a geography exercise that had become the children's favorite, tracing routes on a large map Danny had commissioned from a territorial surveyor, showing how their small community connected to the wider world. It was a lesson in possibility, Elizabeth realized, teaching children that their remote ranch wasn't isolated but part of something larger and more wonderful than they might have imagined. As the last student departed with promises to practice their letters, Elizabeth found Danny in the barn, grooming the horses with the methodical care that characterized everything he did. Buttercup, Samuel's favorite mare, nickered softly at Elizabeth's approach, and she scratched the animal's neck absently while watching her husband work. "Good day of teaching?" Danny asked, not looking up from the curry brush, but smiling at the contentment in her voice. "The best kind." Jenny Patterson read an entire paragraph without stumbling once, and Tommy Henderson finally mastered his multiplication tables. Elizabeth leaned against the stall door, breathing in the familiar scents of hay and leather that had come to represent home and safety. Sarah Beth sent word from Phoenix. The territorial governor is officially investigating court corruption in 3 counties. Your father's arrest opened floodgates no one expected. Danny's hands stilled on the brush. Conversations about his father remained difficult, filled with complex emotions that had no easy resolution. Any word on his trial date? Federal prosecutors are still building their case. Marshal Morrison says it could be months before everything's sorted out legally. Elizabeth reached for Danny's hand, intertwining their fingers. Sarah Beth also mentioned something else. About the Apache families who've been asking about schooling for their children. This was new information, and Danny looked up with interest. The relationship between the Anglo settlers and the local Apache bands remained fragile, built on careful respect rather than easy trust. That Apache parents might consider sending their children to Elizabeth's school represented a significant step toward genuine community integration. "What did you tell her?" "That any child who wants to learn is welcome in my classroom." Elizabeth's voice carried quiet conviction. Education isn't about skin color or tribal affiliation. It's about giving young minds the tools they need to build better futures. Danny's smile held pride and love in equal measure. "And if some of the white parents object?" "Then they're welcome to teach their own children at home." Elizabeth's tone brooked no argument. "But I won't turn away students because of their parents' prejudices." That evening, after Samuel had been tucked into bed with his usual collection of wooden animals and a new book Danny had ordered from Denver, Elizabeth found herself on the front porch swing they'd installed to replace the rocking chair destroyed in the attack. The desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that still took her breath away, even after months of such displays. Danny joined her on the swing, a letter in his hand that she recognized as official federal correspondence. She'd learned to read his expressions well enough to know this brought significant news. "Marshal Morrison?" she asked. Danny nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than worried. "The federal court has officially vacated all of my father's rulings from the past 5 years. Every case will be reviewed, every judgment reconsidered." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "That includes Samuel's custody status. Legally, all claims against you have been dismissed. You're free to go anywhere, do anything you want." The words hung between them like a bridge Elizabeth could choose to cross or burn. Freedom, real, legal, unassailable freedom, was being offered to her and Samuel. They could leave this place where they'd suffered and been afraid, start fresh somewhere no one knew their story or their pain. But as she looked around the ranch, at the garden she'd planted, the school she'd built, the community that had embraced them, Elizabeth realized she'd already made her choice months ago. "The marshal also included something else," Danny continued, his voice carefully neutral. "My father's will, written before his arrest, but legally valid. He's left everything to Samuel, the house in town, the mining investments, a considerable fortune in territorial bonds." Elizabeth's breath caught. "How much?" "Enough to send Samuel to the finest schools back east, Harvard, if he wants it. Enough to buy him a future that this territory can't provide." Danny's voice carried no resentment, only a father's love for the boy who'd become his son in every way that mattered. "And what do you think we should do?" Danny was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains where the last light was fading to purple shadow. "I think Samuel should grow up knowing he has choices. that he comes from a family with resources and education and opportunity. But I also think he should understand that wealth without character is worthless and that the most important lessons can't be bought. Elizabeth leaned against Danny's shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent of leather and sage. So we'll keep the money in trust for Samuel's education, but raise him here? Let him choose his own path when he's old enough? Something like that. Danny's arm tightened around her. Though I'd like him to spend summers back east when he's older. Meeting his eastern relatives, seeing museums and universities, understanding there's a big world beyond Silver Creek. But always knowing this is home, Elizabeth added, that this is where people love him for who he is, not what he inherits. As if summoned by their conversation, Samuel appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, dragging his favorite blanket. "Can't sleep," he announced matter-of-factly. "Too many thoughts." Elizabeth made room on the swing for the boy, who climbed between his parents with the unconscious trust of a child who'd never doubted his place in their hearts. "What kind of thoughts, sweetheart?" "About school tomorrow. Jenny said her mama might let her bring their new puppy to show everyone." Samuel yawned, already growing drowsy in the safety of his parents' embrace. "And about the Apache children, will they really come to our school?" "Would you like them to?" Danny asked gently. Samuel nodded vigorously. "I want to learn their words. And maybe they can teach us about finding water in the desert, like old Miguel showed us." Elizabeth exchanged a look with Danny over Samuel's head. Their son, for he was truly theirs now, legally and emotionally, was already building bridges they'd barely imagined possible. "Sleep now," Elizabeth murmured, stroking Samuel's dark hair. "Tomorrow will bring whatever it brings." As Samuel's breathing deepened into true sleep, Elizabeth and Danny continued to rock gently on the swing, watching stars emerge in the vast desert sky. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details but secure in its foundation of love, community, and shared purpose. "Elizabeth," Danny said softly, "do you ever regret it? The auction, coming here, everything that led to this?" Elizabeth thought of Thomas's violence, of the terrifying months of flight, of standing on that platform feeling like the last hope was being stripped away. Then she looked at the man beside her, her husband, her partner, Samuel's father in every way that mattered, and at the sleeping child who would grow up knowing he was cherished beyond measure. "Never," she whispered, "not for a single moment. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us to the best things in our lives." Danny's response was lost in a gentle kiss that tasted of desert wind and promises kept. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the vast emptiness, but their voices no longer sounded lonely. They sounded like family, like belonging, like the music of home. The little boy who'd been sold at auction had become the heart of a community. The woman who'd been treated as property had become a teacher shaping young minds. The man who'd sacrificed everything for principle had found that love multiplied rather than diminished when freely given. And in the morning, Elizabeth knew, she would ring the school bell that called children to learning, Danny would tend the animals that sustained their ranch, and Samuel would wake in a house filled with love and security. It was, she thought drowsily, exactly the kind of ordinary miracle that made life worth living. Sometimes life strips everything away before showing us what truly matters. Elizabeth Hawthorne's journey from that humiliating auction block to a schoolhouse filled with children's laughter reminds us that our darkest moments often precede our greatest blessings. At 55, 60, or 65, many of us know the weight of broken dreams. Perhaps a marriage that didn't survive, children who grew distant, careers that ended too soon, or simply the quiet ache of wondering if our best years are behind us. But Elizabeth's story whispers a profound truth. It's never too late for love to find us, for family to choose us, or for our lives to take an unexpected turn toward joy. Danny Whitmore didn't just rescue a woman and child from a corrupt system. He discovered that healing his own wounds meant opening his heart to wounded souls who needed him as much as he needed them. The ranch that became their home wasn't just property. It was proof that chosen families can be stronger than blood, that second chances exist for those brave enough to reach for them. Your story isn't over. Your most beautiful chapter might still be unwritten, waiting for the courage to turn the page. Questions for reflection. What auction block moment in your life led you to unexpected blessing? How has choosing love over fear changed your path? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you found hope after heartbreak.